Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. As promised, welcome to this webinar, which is a webinar on how Africa works, which is a conversation with Joe Studwell. We're just waiting for Joe to join us. He's having a bit of technical difficulties, so we will re-engineer the program just slightly to start with early reflections from our two other speakers, and then we will go into the presentation. With that being said, I'm very delighted to welcome you all to this conversation. This is a conversation that is part of AGRA's growing webinar series that we've been creating. Essentially, we've been creating a space for honest, practical dialogue across policy, practice, and farmer realities. These conversations we found are truly critical to be able to listen as a sector, but to also challenge ourselves and shape what comes next for Africa's food systems. It is a particularly special year for us at AGRA as we approach marking 20 years of AGRA's existence, a moment of reflection, but also asking harder questions about the future of Africa's food systems. Today's session, as I said, is slightly different. What we'll be doing is taking a deep dive into a set of ideas that are presented in the book, How Africa Works, and putting those ideas into conversations with policy and lived experience. Of course, we will be joined by Joe Studwell, who's the author of How Africa Works, as soon as he's able to figure out technical issues. And then we are also delighted to be joined by Professor Njuguna Ndung'u, who's the former Cabinet Secretary for Finance and former Governor of the Central Bank of Kenya. And we're joined by Charles Macharia, who is a farmer on Masai Farm. And of course, all of you who are joining us today, who are an important part of this conversation. Before we get into the conversation, just a quick note on how we will run the session. We will start, as I mentioned, with just a quick reflections as we wait for Joe. And after that, we will be able to also open up for a Q&A to everybody who's joining. What I will advise for people online is to share your thoughts in the Q&A so that we're able to get the questions and pose them to the speakers. But before we get to that point, I'm just going to transition to Professor. As you are here with us, as we wait for Joe, I just want to get your perspective. The book presents a very honest and candid conversation about the many things that have worked for Africa's economies, but there's also the realities of what is it that we can benefit from in terms of an agriculture transformation. Among some of the key ideas really is the conversation around how agriculture, because it's able to benefit other sectors, it also has the benefit of ensuring that we're able to lift people out of poverty. But I just want to get your initial reactions before we wait for Joe in terms of what are some of your ideas, but also drawing on your experience, really. Thank you so much. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much indeed. And this is a very important subject matter. And I would have liked to listen to the presenter, although he came, Joe, to listen to his presentation of this volume. And of course, it is also good to contrast with how Asia works, isn't it? It will be very interesting to contrast with how Asia works. But you are right, agriculture is the mainstay. The largest proportion of the population is in that sector. But why has it not provided that structural transformation that everybody anticipated? Why has it not engineered the industrialization? We can debate this for a long time, and you can see that from the 1960s session of papers and all that. But I think there is a problem with policy implementation. But that is just what we see. I think the major problem is also the institutional failure problem. And that is something that we're going to maybe debate further, because even if you take one sector, for example, take coffee or even tea, any of those products, you have seen how cooperatives in Kenya work. They are very major aggregators at the rural setting, and they bring their products to the factory, they are processed. But after that, everything goes wrong because the returns on the farmer is not adequate. So we have to come back and ask ourselves, what is the problem? The other aspect, you can move away from industrialization and economic transformation and all that, and even go into what about the manufacturing industry? Because why didn't we power our manufacturing industry using our industrial, using our agricultural potential? Again, this is another institutional failure problem. Let me say at the outset that once institutions fail, markets will also fail. I'll be making that point much stronger later, because essentially what we see is an institutional failure problem, but behind the institutional failure problem, no, the resource of institutional failure problem is actually a policy failure problem, because you cannot implement policy. Those are some of the thinking, because essentially the potential has been there. We have tried to amend even laws, but we don't get there. So the question is, why don't we get there? The third area is that, why do we have food deficiency? And food deficiency is a major issue. It's a major issue across the continent. It's a major issue not only for health and nutrition, but it's also a major issue of development. Because essentially, if you're going to use the fiscal revenues to import food, whereas you have adequate agricultural land to cultivate, then it means there is a problem somewhere. Again, this is what I call the missing middle. It is the marketplace. It is the market that's failing us. People can produce for the market, but if the market collapses, then we cannot get there. So there are so many issues that we talk about, but we hedge against we hedge against institutional failure, but behind the institutional failure is the political economy issues. I don't like going into political economy issues because they are a little bit messy. But obviously, it is good to summarize that behind that is a major issue of political economy issues. If you are Kenyan, you have seen the newspapers of late. If you look at papers in the last 2 weeks, you can see headlines. And those headlines are relating to political economy issues. They are beneficial, but sometimes they are harmful. And you can see where the harm is, that they can affect investments trajectory. They can affect even production processes. So the moment investors don't go into the market to invest and look for profitable sectors, then obviously we cannot move. So there's so many aspects that we can pick from this. But I'll be picking up also on issues of, yes, how Africa works. Which Africa? Which Africa? Because Africa has so many countries. And I'll be showing clearly, and especially from the works that I've done myself and the works that we have done, I've participated with other people who have done, and it is also, it is actually picking us in a very tight corner of why, when we look at India in the last 30 years, why has India reshaped itself and become one of the biggest economies? Why did China, after 50 years, it has become one of the big economies? What can we learn from there? But at the far opposite, what is wrong with Nigeria? In the last 30 years, Nigeria today has the most poor and impoverished people in the world. That is where India was 30 years ago. A friend of mine published a book in 2022, and he argues that actually in developing world, development is a gamble. So essentially, when we listen how Africa works, I'll be bringing those examples to show actually development is a gamble. How do we gamble on development? That's something that I could come back to, but for now, let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think that's very insightful, and it actually sets the stage well for us to be able to get into the conversation. Joe, I just want to make sure your audio is working and that you're ready to hand over the mic to you.
Yeah, well, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you so much for joining us. We just started off the conversation with a really good reflection from the professor, who has had massive experience in the Kenyan context, but also overall on the continent. And he's given an early reflection, which I think sets the stage up well to hear your reflections and to hear what are the main arguments that are coming out of how Africa works. And if possible, if you could juxtapose that with some of your findings that also came out of how Asia works. With that said, I want to hand over the stage to you. And as you go through your slides, feel free to just say next slide and we will support you on this side. Over to you.
Let's go through the background to the How Africa Works book. Is that How Asia Works was quite a widely read book. And it was, one of the people who liked it was Bill Gates. And I was asked to go to Seattle and I talked with him for an hour about Asia. But at the end of the conversation, he said, but the thing I would really like to know is what you think about Africa. And I didn't think anything very much about this. at the time. But then I was invited by the Ethiopian and the Rwandan governments to go and look at what they were doing. And initially I said, there's no point because I don't know anything about Africa. And they said, no, but we want to talk about Asian development policy. And I went and I was really impressed by how focused, how informed people were in government and the civil service. And I thought, actually, there's something interesting here. So then the Gates Foundation and Omidyar agreed to cover the cost of the research for an Africa book. So that's how the whole thing happened. It took me a long time because, you know, when you're as ignorant as I was at the beginning, you've just got to put in a lot of time in such a vast continent with 55 countries or 54, depending on whose count you're using. And also spent a lot of time reading through the literature, the academic literature on Africa. And I read through all of the stuff about governance. There's been a huge literature on governance failure in Africa. There's been a big literature on corruption and kleptocracy in Africa, and there's been a big literature on civil strife and ethnic strife in Africa as reasons why the continent would be further behind in developmental terms. But when I read that literature, I just felt that it was kind of proximate explanations, not really fundamental explanations. And it was only really when I got back to the 1940s, 1950s, and I read one or two African economists and other academics, one a historian, talking about demographics, that I realized that there was something that seemed to me more fundamental. And the point that they were making was that in 1960, the sort of start of the independence era, the population density on average in Africa was under 10 people per square kilometer, which was the same as Europe in 1500. And so this made me think, I was trained as a historian myself, so I'm thinking, well, there was no growth in Europe in 1500. Maybe it's not a surprise there was no growth in Africa. And so demographic density needed to increase. And if we look at the next slide, we can see the long run story of Asia versus Africa in demographic terms. So if you look at the gray line there, Southeast Asia went from 50 people per square kilometer to over 150 today. The whole of East Asia went from 70 to 140. So those two regions started with sufficient demographic density to be able to get effective economic development, whereas Africa starts at under 10 people per square kilometer and gets up to 50 today, or the end of this decade will be 50. And so at the end of this decade, sub-Saharan Africa will be where Southeast Asia was in 1960. And this is important. And we just remember some of the reasons why demographic density is important. So first of all, if you've got a very sparse population, you don't have markets, particularly you don't have urban markets, dense urban markets that are critical to driving demand and technological change. You know, if you go back to 1900, the biggest cities in Africa were Lagos and Dar, and the population of both was about 20,000 people. You know, if you look at Singapore at the time, it was 250,000. Shanghai was 500,000. They were completely different situations. So you don't have markets, and also fundamentally, the calculation for paying for infrastructure does not work with sparse population, because the cost of infrastructure, whether it's roads or electricity or whatever you want to build, irrigation, you've got to look at it on a per capita basis, and you can't afford it if you don't have sufficient population density. There are also fiscal considerations. If you don't have dense population, particularly in cities, you can't collect taxes. And I'm sure you all know that the tax take as a share of GDP in Africa is very low. In Europe, everywhere in the world, the increase in the fiscal capacity of states was very closely connected to the growth of cities. You need cities. It's much easier to tax people in cities than in the countryside. So all of these reasons meant that African development, in my view, after 1960, was not going to happen until demographic density increased. And now it's increased. And the book does not claim that this is some miracle moment now where growth will shoot up very quickly. But it says that finally Africa is in the developmental game. It's a different situation to what we had in 1960. And if we look at the next slide, we'll see there's a lot of variation. We've just got some selected countries here. There's a lot of variation in demographic density and how it's increased in Africa if you look country by country. But basically, most countries are getting into now the Asian area around 1960. The obvious question for Nigeria at the top, if Nigeria has gone to 250 people per square kilometer, why isn't Nigeria booming? So there's two sides to answering this question. One side is to say, well, of course, Nigeria reminds us of all the other problems that we have in African countries. The ethnic diversity, which creates competition between different ethnicities. And of course, 6-7 years after independence, Nigeria has a horrible civil war that kills 1 million people. And Nigeria as a country has been trying to damp down the ethnic conflict or the ethnic tensions ever since then. I mean, interestingly, the ethnic diversity of Africa largely comes out of the demographics, because historically, multiple thousands of different ethnicities could survive on the continent because they could, if they quarreled, they could always find new land to move on to. It was the opposite of European history, where Europe was always more densely populated and Europeans fought each other, and the winners imposed their values and their rule on the losers. The historical evidence is that there was much less conflict in Africa historically, because people could just move away and start again. Anyway, so Nigeria reminds us that demographic density gets you in the game, but there's a bunch of other problems as well. However, I would say in Nigeria's defense that in agriculture, which is where I would expect to see the first evidence of a higher growth rate in Africa, because agriculture occupies 75-80% of the population. If you look at Nigeria, since 2000, the average annual growth of agricultural GDP has been just under 6%. All right, and this is not a reflection of the quality of government, I think. This is a reflection of the demographic change and the demand for food, because in Africa in the last 25 years, as population doubled, the demand for food tripled. And that's a function of having a bit of GDP growth alongside demographic growth. So I don't think that Nigeria is an economic disaster. I think there are some more positive signs. I mean, I think if we look at the current administration and Tinubu, we look at him getting rid of the petroleum subsidy. No, everyone said that that was impossible. And yet that's something that has been done. If we look at what Dangote's achieved with the oil refinery after the cement business, there's some evidence. There is some evidence of new and positive things going on in Nigeria, I think. Okay, so the next slide. There are not many slides, by the way. Yeah, so this is the story. I mean, here we're looking at the population per hectare on the right-hand scale, and it's gone from 2 to 5. And then if we look at the area under crops, I'm sure you all know this story. The area under crops has gone from 140 million hectares to about 270. And this is a story of a continent that has massive cultivable land still available that is not being used. Of course, big variation country by country, but if you go down to Tanzania, for instance, you can still find vast areas that are not cultivated. World Bank thinks that perhaps half of the uncultivated agricultural land in the world is on the African continent. But more has come into cultivation, and that's helped to produce the increase in output. But the place that we see qualitative change, which again, AGRA will be very aware of, is around the cities where you get this very dense demand. There, we're seeing farmer-led irrigation. There, we're seeing increases in yields, which sometimes get close to Asian yields. So that's a big change, but it's very localized around towns and cities. And the next slide. Yeah, so the point that I was making earlier, there is Nigeria's agricultural growth since 2000. It's nearly 6%. Okay, I mean, sorry, this is mislabeled, this slide. It should be FAO data, not UNCTAD. But, even places somewhere as I suppose unmanaged rather than mismanaged, perhaps, as unmanaged as Mozambique, its agricultural growth for 25 years has been beating China, Vietnam, and Thailand. And then the sort of extreme case there, Mali, if you believe the data, my guess is that the data might not be so wrong in Mali, but the thing that's very telling is that Mali, and Burkina Faso has very, very strong growth as well, is that they are quite land efficient, or they're some of the most land efficient, cultivable land efficient countries in Africa. And perhaps it's the same as we saw in East Asia in the past, that it's the countries that have the least available cultivable land that start to increase yields first and fastest. And the next slide. So, yeah, I mean, this perhaps should be a question mark, but one of the problems, in my view, that African countries have had in the post-1960 era is very erratic growth. And a lot of that came out of mineral dependency and hydrocarbon dependency in a big minority of countries. With the growth of the agricultural sector, I think that is helping Africa to produce fewer of these deep recessions. And that's very important to encouraging the private sector to invest. We're not seeing very strong private sector investment yet, but I think we're beginning to see the conditions created where that can happen in the future. And the next slide. Okay, yeah, then we come to manufacturing. And if you've read How Asia Works, the first part is about the agriculture, and the second part is about people moving out of agriculture and into manufacturing. And we do not yet see that in Africa. But what we do have is enclaves of manufacturing activity. And I visited these in Madagascar, in Lesotho, in Tunisia, in Morocco. And when you go and you visit the factories, I could not see any reason why Africa cannot do more manufacturing. And again, we go back to the demographics. If you look at wage rates in 1960, on average, African wage rates were about double what they were in East Asia. Today, African wage rates are between half and 1/10 of those in China, the dominant manufacturing force in East Asia, which produces a third of the world's manufacturers. So factory labor rates in China now are $600 to $700 a month. In Madagascar, they're $60 a month. In Ethiopia, they're $65 a month. So I don't think there is a reason why Africa cannot build larger manufacturing enclaves. The main problem, I think, is that politicians do not, partly they don't take manufacturing sufficiently seriously, and partly I think they like to dream that there's some other possibility in the services sector that is going to create the jobs that Africa needs. And my conviction is that's absolutely not the case. Africa needs to generate manufacturing jobs, or it's going to have very high levels of unemployment. And as a result of that, it will have unnecessary civil unrest. And the next slide. Yeah, so this is the last one. And I think, we just need to remind ourselves that if Africa is going to capture the world's attention, most obviously the rate of investment needs to increase. And if we look at the end of the red line representing sub-Saharan Africa, we can see, the line has been rising again there. And if we want to be optimistic, we could say, well, Africa now is where India was in 1991 when India's big pickup in growth began, and it's where East Asia was in the early 1960s when its pickup in growth began. So it doesn't feel impossible to see a step change in the investment rate in Africa, but it's going to change. It's going to require more effective governance than we've seen in the past. But I think that better demographics, more potential tax income, that create the possibility for virtuous circles, that we start to see better governance in Africa, and we start to see governments with more sufficient fiscal revenue that allows them to do more things. Above all, governments in Africa have just been impoverished in the past. It's not to say that they haven't misgoverned, they have misgoverned, but they just haven't had the demographic conditions to do better. I'll stop there because I'm sure I've taken more time than I should have done.
No worries, Joe. This is exactly why we needed you here today. It's to be able to hear all these very insightful pieces. I think something that is quite interesting, at least when I went through the book, it's also just thinking about how when the population shifts and how much that also has on transformation. And I found that quite insightful and potentially something that we're not always thinking about on the day-to-day in food systems. On that note, I just want to bring you back in, Professor, if you have brief reflections on that presentation, and then we will go to Charles also for his reflections.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And indeed, that is a wonderful presentation because I didn't have the benefit of reading the book, so I'm so sorry. But I think when the title itself is catchy, How Africa Works, and that is very, very important for us because when we look at success and failure with the world's least developed frontier, it's actually something to ask ourselves, what is the problem? I like the summary. I think when I read the brief preface was that the argument was threefold. First is broad-based agricultural productivity growth is going to be the foundation of African economies. And the second one was that we need a capable programmatic public policy, which is necessary to translate the gains into employment generation and even create a room for structural transformation. And third, competitiveness is an export-oriented manufacturing that remains central to sustain any form of prosperity and even sustainable job creation. And I like that because for me, that is very, very critical. And I can see that you presented the graphs, which are quite, let me say, detailed data that is quite, you can tell a lot of stories in that data. But let me respond in three or so points. First, one of the things is that I always ask myself, do we forget the role of institutions? Because I think this is where, having been in public sector myself, I've worked in financial system and I have been governor of the central bank as a regulator. I could see that when the regulator fails, then the market fails. And it's going to be difficult. Everybody reminds me what I did, but the whole issue is that we need strong institutions. And this has been the major failure. Why do I talk about institutions? First, institutions are going to uphold the rules of the game. That is the legal framework. It is only the institutions that can apply the rules of the game or the legal framework. They can uphold the legal framework. And second, the institutions will define appropriate incentives. And you can see a combination of legal framework, that is the rules of the game, and appropriate incentives is going to encourage prudent behavior in the marketplace. That point I was making it so that it brings me now into how markets are affected by institutions. Why markets fail is because the institutions have failed them. Let me say, and especially in Africa, markets need to be protected. markets need to be regulated, and markets need to be guided. Without those three, you'll see that a market can start production. For example, we have seen we are exporting avocados to China. Within no time, there are no standards. Within no time, they are getting the market collapses because standards must be upheld. The rules of the game must be read. And then this is where we have a very strong line between production at the agricultural sector. For example, if you look at markets at the top here, you are watching the markets from downstream as a producer. You see the market is functioning. Your first step is to increase production. And as the market gives you that certainty, the second step is actually to increase productivity. For me, then it is saying productivity is equal to profitability. That's when we can talk about transformation. But this is the missing middle, that is markets. This is the missing middle that we really need to confront. And I'm happy because you kept on coming back to political institutions, policy, the governance structures. Those are the ones that spoil the party. Now, I'm very happy that you have taken them very well. The second point is that you're right. Let me tell you, strong growth can reduce poverty significantly. This is from works I've done, we have managed to do when I was in African Economic Research Consortium. We showed that actually strong growth reduces poverty significantly, but it has to also support to lessen the distribution. That is, we have to make sure that we have social protection program to protect those who are left behind. And we have seen that social protection programs can work. So strong growth alone will not actually lift we will not bring the economic transformation. We need to see how do we reduce inequality. Inequality is not across households, but also across regions in countries like ours, where we have some good areas, like you said, the cities, but there are semi-arid areas, there are agricultural potential areas. We need to do that. But of course, your point is also very clear that infrastructure is very costly. And that point is very important. Infrastructure, when you have sparse population, can be very expensive. But what is the role of infrastructure, especially in Africa? It reduces transactions cost. And most of these small farmers, small businesses are transactions heavy. The moment you lower their transactions cost, then it means that you enhance their profitability. And that is the cycle that we want. So it's essentially, we find ourselves in a quagmire that the population sparsity, the cost of infrastructure is problematic, and so many things that come up. You can see that we are locked up in a very difficult environment. But it means that there is some space, because again, it starts from the institution, even providing that infrastructure. When I was a young man in the late 70s, in the early 70s and the late 70s, I used to see, why don't we have a tarmac road? I would come from school. No, the British tradition, we were in secondary schools, they are boarding, and you come all the way from a different region, there's tarmac, but when you can come near home, there's no tarmac. If it is wet, you have to walk. So I know this, but you see, the priority was productive areas. Anyway, I don't want to take much more time. Let me go to the fourth point, the political economy issue. This is always catchy, but it always spoils the party. But let me give examples instead. In 2022, I was invited by my friend Stephen Dacon in Oxford. He was launching a book on development is a gabble. I don't know whether I have the correct title, but the whole idea is that development is a gabble in Africa. What does that mean? It means that once the elections are won and concluded, it depends on which elite captures the state. If it's a development elite, you're going to see the results you have seen in China for the last 50 years, India for the last 30 years. But if it is captured by the other one, that is the rooting elite, they're coming to root the state, you're going to have results that you see. For example, Nigeria is one of the most impoverished, has the most impoverished poor people in the world today. That is where India was 30 years ago. Those are the examples from the book. And actually, even Kenya ranks among the top 5 there in terms of that kind of structure. So it's a whole idea of who captures the state. Is it a development elite or is it a routing elite? Now, there's also some work that we did way back in 2001. The book was published in 2005 with Paul Collier of Oxford. And one of the things we were doing was to try and say, we asked the question, what sustains civil wars in Africa? And we came to the conclusion that the main theme was that actually civil wars are sustained by countries with natural resources that can be rooted and coordinate a rebellion against the government. And you see then that's sustained, and then you can see some countries in the same similar space. But when the project was going on, I remember Paul Collier turning to me and my friend, Ret Mwangi Kimenyi, and saying, I think, Njuguna, we need a chapter for Kenya. We said, Kenya has never had a civil war. He said, Kenya, we were told that Kenya is the dog that didn't bark. What does that mean? It means that Kenya was nearing that kind of event where there is going to be cycles of violence during elections. But why? We came to the conclusion, we went further and tried now, because we had to write a chapter, we went into those constituencies in Kenya that had violence. And we realized that the whole idea, and that's, I liked Joe's idea about ethnicity and ethnic groups, where it was ethnic, what Paul Collier termed as ethno-linguistic fractionalization, where you had fractional or ethnically, not concentrated, not dominant ethnic groups, there was no violence. But where you had a dominant ethnic group, that's where violence was most, because they needed to chase others. But why were they doing this? Because in Kenya, being in government is a rootable resource. That's the conclusion. Being in government is a rootable resource. Now, that is the person you want to go in government through that process, and you expect that you're going to have elaborate development policy. It's going to be a mistake. That book was published in 2005. I shared it during the 2008 crisis. And I remember the late President Kibaki actually asked me, why didn't you share it before? That time I was the governor of the central bank. I had moved. But I didn't share it because, of course, you didn't anticipate such things. But the most important thing is that, finally, the final example, why are institutions weak? The whole issue is about human capital development. I wish, Joe, you could have provided indicators of human capital development across Asia and Africa. I initiated a study funded again by Gates Foundation in 2018, and we wanted to look at human capital development. And we wanted to we looked at health and related to nutrition, and then education and the labor market. And those four buckets, you see how they relate to each other.
Yeah.
But the conclusion was doubling. The conclusion was so serious. For example, for education, it was not only bad, but it was getting worse. So nutrition issues are becoming more severe. So you can see we are trapped. Even the future of institutions is still a challenge. And that's why I wanted to stop on that point, because it can also allow us to think about so many things. But I'm happy about the examples you have provided, because essentially this allows us to think like outside the box. But if I have repeated what you have already said, I didn't read the book. I'm sure AGRA will make sure that I have a copy. I would have liked to have read the book, but the synopsis that I got was adequate, and even your presentation was quite appropriate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor.
Can I just say two quick things? Yeah. So I thought they were all really good points. I mean, you'll be interested when you read the book that I think that on education, it kind of depends on what you take as the baseline. So I argue in the book that if you take 1960 as the baseline, the African performance is actually very good in terms of building school systems, because Africa was pretty unique in not having colonial government operated school systems. There were just some missionary schools, really just from the 1950s, colonial government started to put a little bit of money. So in 1960, Africa had a a literacy rate of 16%, 1/6. Female literacy was 5%. So if you compare today with 1960, and the World Bank did a big report actually, and they said this is the fastest expansion of public education systems that the world has seen. So, I mean, when you look in more recently, you can say there are quality problems and all of, but I think if you look long term, you know, Africans should actually feel that the continent has done quite well. You know, really very well, actually, if you take 1960 as a baseline. But on the other point about institutions, I mean, I think it's important. And one thing, again, that you might find interesting when you read the book, and which occurred to me, was in the second part of the book, I look at Ethiopia and Rwanda and Botswana and Mauritius as African countries that have had more successful development. And I didn't realize this at the beginning, but as I looked at them and understood them politically, I said at the end, what did each of these places have in common? And the thing they had in common was a political coalition that was cross-ethnic. Now, in Mauritius and Botswana, these were like pure democratic coalitions. In Ethiopia, it was a little bit of a fake coalition because the Tigrayans were always manipulating behind the scenes. But if you look at cabinet and you look at civil service, you had people from all different ethnicities in very senior jobs. And also in Rwanda, you can say it's a bit fake because it was supposed to be, you know, Hutu-led in the beginning, and it's become more and more Tutsi-led. But nonetheless, they all understood that in ethnically, what you and Collier would describe as ethnically fragmented situations, putting government together that's like an umbrella across ethnicities is what you need to do if you're going to put development first. I mean, basically, it's a way of saying, okay, ethnic difference, we're not going to deny it, but it's not our principal concern. Development is our principal concern. And in the book, I say, you know, going forward, I think we will see more cross-ethnic coalitions. We won't see 55 of them, but we'll see more than we've seen so far, and that will be important. And when it happens, my takeaway was that when you get a coalition that's committed to development, it's actually quicker than you might imagine to build good institutions. So I talked about Botswana and training the civil service after independence there. And only 10 years after independence, the government sent 2 young guys, Botswana, to negotiate the 3rd diamond mine deal with De Beers. Can you imagine? These guys were like not even 30, I think. And they went and they led the negotiations with De Beers. And that's what they created in 10 years in terms of, you know, they sent people for courses overseas and got them plenty of training, but they had, you know, that institutional quality after only a decade. And I think similarly, I mean, you can look at Ethiopia, what Meles did in Ethiopia institutionally, and what Kagame did, you know, with this very interesting civil service where women are, you know, not just overrepresented by African standards, they're overrepresented by global standards. I think Rwanda is like number 6 in the world for female representation in parliament, judiciary, and civil service now. So I think if you can get the central coalition committed to development, we can be quite optimistic about what you can do with institutions. But I completely agree with you that institutions are a big issue.
Thank you so much, Joe and Prof. I actually quite like that the conversation has organically you've been able to kind of pull on those threads. I do want to turn to Charles, because actually Joe has a very interesting segment in the book, which is about what farmers say. And I thought it would be a really good piece to be able to hear from somebody who's experiencing this on a day-to-day, to be able to talk about some of the challenges you face on your day-to-day, Charles, but also where do you see the points of conversation from having heard the 2 speakers? Where do you see the ability to be able to think about this in the way that we are thinking of food systems for the future? Over to you, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name's Charles. Actually, I'm a farmer. Right from the background of upbringing. About 60 years ago, you know, that is not a short time. I'm now in the 6th floor. And I grew up in a family which believed in farming. My daddy, just by coincidence, worked with the colonial government as a tobacco leaf officer in the British African Tobacco Company. So he taught us, and he actually mentored me on how to earn a decent livelihood by working on the soil. So as I come to share my experience, I want to believe that I'll be giving the best that I can from the perspective of being a farmer. I have seen transformation from sustainable agriculture in the olden days up to now, when we have seen agriculture as a way of earning a decent livelihood in our families. I have also seen the transition from the period when we used to do agriculture using the locally available inputs, that is from the farm, up to now when we use industrial inputs. Talk about the seeds, we have the hybrids, we have fertilizers and agrochemicals. If you look at our perspective in central Kenya, basically I come from a small county called Kirinyaga. We have no minerals and nothing else because soil is the main resource, or land is the main resource that earns livelihoods in this specific county. And looking at how we produce our food in terms of productivity, 80% of the food that we eat in our country is actually produced by the smallholder farmers. If I look at the earlier days, because I was born in 1964, food was not an issue. We could walk into any household and have food to eat. Today, before somebody can allow such kind of food to flow, they have to think twice because food is very scarce. And therefore, that has also seen us now to moving from those massive areas of land, which used to be almost owned by community, up to where we are now doing agriculture on very small fragments of land. And to me, we are using very tiny units of land to produce more, and therefore productivity on our land, to me, has actually increased because we are maximizing returns on a very small unit of area where we can do mixed farming, you can have animals, you can grow crops, and space allowing, you also have a perennial crop that can actually generate massive volumes of food. Personally, I also do high value crops on very small pieces of land, that is herbs and spices, and they give me a decent income. Now, allow me also to discuss something that has actually been touched by Professor Njuguna, much to do with infrastructure development. We cannot say that our country, just like so many others in Africa, are where we were in the 60s and 50s. In terms of infrastructure, we are seeing the development come in every day. Like today, I can speak from my house and I can be able to link with the entire world because Wi-Fi is actually a thing of the day. In the olden days, when we had the dial phones, that was actually something very strange, that you could link with the globe and be able to tap information that may help you to be productive. Today, it is possible. I also want to look at policy support and looking at where the Kenyan government was in the 60s and today. We are now talking about the devolved government, where we have small units called the counties actually governing how people should use their land. And because every county is unique in its own way, the way people live, like the pastoralists cannot be like us who are in central Kenya, here our county government actually ensures and struggles to ensure that every person producing from the soil, or called a farmer, is getting the best, with an intention that in a few years to come, we shall be where a county should be in terms of empowering its own community. So like here in our particular county, we have developed the aggregation centers where farmers collect their produce and it is bundled so that it can be bulked and the buyers may come and collect it from one single unit. Talk about the cold storage, and now we have an industrial park, which I believe is an initiative that each and every county should be embracing. So that has created opportunities because as farmers, when we produce and we have avenues where we can channel our produce to go to the markets and be able to actually sell and get returns, we feel that it is better. And then value addition coming because of the establishment of these industrial parks, it will see the value of our produce coming to be better. That has been a great opportunity. The increase in urban setups has also increased food demand, and that is also playing a better role for us to find markets. However, you have challenges, and challenges are there. One being price fluctuations, because every farmer deserves to have some constant returns so that they may be able to plan and even estimate the returns. Drought and climate change is really biting on us. Exploitation by middlemen. Of course, this is a big, big disaster to our farming communities, and we know that we have killed the spirit of the cooperatives. Poor extension service support is also another big challenge. The connection between the researcher and the farmer. We know that we have a lot of paperwork that is rotting and gathering dust in our research institutions, but it really flows down to us as the farmers. Corruption, another big thorn in the flesh. And then we also have high taxation that has seen the limitation in access to inputs and also limited democracy, especially in seed choice. We know here in Kenya, in particular, we are battling with the seed law, which is so punitive. And then, of course, prevalence of pests and diseases, that is still a battle to fight. We have a lot of pests that are so resistant to the agrochemicals or pesticides that are meant to control them. And of course, limited access to capital because to finance agriculture and get loans, that is a tall order because credit facilities in Kenya are quite expensive. And of course, finally, as I wind up, I want to talk about traceability of what we take to the market. Can our farmers trust the kind of food that we avail to the markets for them to consume in terms of safety and in terms of meeting the nutritional demands? Because most of us, like farmers, we are unable to use pesticides and even fertilizers at the recommended rates because we lack even that kind of extension support that is meant to bridge the gap between those who know and those who do not know. Otherwise, the conversation is so good and it is coming timely because this is the time we should be thinking about how do we revolutionize farming in Africa. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Really great insights from you there. And I think that there's a lot to react to from Joe. We have about 20 minutes left in our webinar. So what we want to do is really get some questions as well that we've had coming through the chat that you can respond to in addition to Charles's reflections. So Joe, one of the questions that we have seen coming in from Arno is, do you think that the structural issues that are present today with the Chinese-led manufacturing global economy will present headwinds for Africa and that Africa won't be able to compete against? Unless it's garments, there aren't many widget manufacturing opportunities that can genuinely compete against China in a global system. I think in your book also you reflected quite a lot on Mauritius where manufacturing and garments comes up, and I think that's a good question coming in. I'll read out just one more question and then hand back to you. We see a question coming in from Hillary, and it says, looking at the population versus expanded agricultural land, and considering countries have varying levels of factors like soil, climate, vegetation, so on, contributing to food productivity, how can these metrics provide a projection for the future of Africa? Over to you, Joe.
Well, just a couple of things on Kenya, and thank you for that insight into farming life. But I mean, Kenya is, of course, a reminder of how different African countries are and how different their histories are. I mean, I'm always intrigued by Kenya for one thing, because of the white settler colonies that there were in Africa, of which there were 12. Kenya is the only one that escapes without a war of liberation essentially against the white settler people. And of course, it does that largely because of the Mau Mau rebellion, which leads first the British, and then after independence, the post-independence leadership, to indulge in some land reform and to distribute some agricultural land to smallholders. So Kenya actually kicked off very well in that respect, and still has things like its tea industry as a result of the emphasis on smallholders, in order to basically, because of how frightened the political leadership became about the possibility of further rebellion and insurgency of the type that the Mau Mau represented. But of course, today, if we look at political leadership, you don't see much commitment to smallholders in Kenya. You see political families that really like the idea of large-scale farming and are happy to be engaged in large-scale farming themselves. So it's interesting there. And then what the gentleman said about the transition to small plots, smaller and smaller plots. Of course, in parts of Africa, we see this happening year by year now. In the Great Lakes region, we see it in Kenya, but then in other places, or we see it in the Ethiopian highlands. But then in other places, if you go to the Ethiopian lowlands, or you go, as I said before, to Tanzania, there's still more land than people can possibly use. So it's a very mixed picture. But the direction of travel is definitely towards smaller plots, and when you can no longer produce more by extensifying, by using more land, you've got to increase your productivity. And that's a good thing, because all things being equal, you should be more profitable getting more out of a smaller area of land than simply using a larger area of land. So it should be positive, but of course, governments have got to provide the infrastructure and the support that's necessary for farming. On the other questions, China manufacturing as a headwind for potential African manufacturing, cost is very important at the end of the day with low value added manufacturing, particularly if you think about garments, but also a lot of other things that are just beyond garments in the value added scale. And the bottom line is that factory labor costs $600 to $700 a month in China now. In the mid-1990s, it cost $60, so it's gone up 10 times. And as I said, in Ethiopia or in Madagascar, it still costs $60. And that counts for a lot, so long as you can provide the logistics, the infrastructure, and the stability, critically the political stability. Because there are plenty of investors in Madagascar in the garment sector there, which functions very well, but there are plenty of investors there who've already seen 2 coups. And what you do not want as a manufacturer, an export manufacturer, is a coup every few years. So I don't think that China presents an irresistible headwind to manufacturing in Africa. But possibly more of a challenge is the competition from parts of Southeast Asia that still have relatively low labor costs, like Indonesia, and possibly India, which was a real laggard in getting into manufacturing and is now pushing a bit more on that. And as with anything, early success tends to generate more success. Once you get some manufacturing in place, you tend to get other manufacturers in. And India is expanding its manufacturing economy a bit. But the big picture with India, if you compare it with China, is that India's economy is still less than 1/5 of the size of China's. And the main reason for that is because the Indians didn't get manufacturing organized. They didn't take it seriously. So to me, that is the lesson for African governments. You know, if you want to see what happens if you don't take manufacturing seriously, look at India. And they're now desperately, of course, trying to play catch up. And the last question on agricultural productivity and indicators, I didn't quite capture all of that, but I mean, my thoughts on agricultural productivity are that, you know, you've got to, I mean, in any kind of development, you've got to make locally informed, inductive judgments that are based on what's going on the ground. And for me, all good development is based on observation on the ground. It's not based on deductive ideas about what's missing in Africa that are dreamed up, you know, in meeting rooms in London or New York.
Thank you very much, Joe. I want to pose another two questions also coming from the chat. I think the chat is quite keen to hear more in depth around the deeper political economy and structural economic issues that are linked to agriculture food systems. One specific question is, how would urbanization and population density affect vertical power distribution and align incentives among elites and non-elites? The other one is actually a question from myself. You trace quite in depth across Rwanda, Ethiopia, Botswana, and Mauritius. And I think there is where we have the best example of showing what are the common factors you find, especially in relation to political economy, but also the governance issues. I think you alluded to this when both you and Professor talked about a collision and when you spoke about ethnicities, but it would be good to also ensure we link that back to how that now impacts agriculture and food systems.
Okay, so urbanization, as I said, critically important to development. It has been everywhere in the world for all kinds of reasons. Fiscal reasons, raising money from urban populations is much easier than from rural populations. But in terms of agriculture, you know, if you go to the peri-urban area of any big town, city in Africa, you'll find farmers doing farmer-led irrigation. And when it's surveyed how much money they're making per hectare, it's commonly in the thousands of dollars per hectare. You know, compared with a rain-fed average across sub-Saharan Africa, which is somewhere around $500, and it can get to a differential of 20 times. So these people are producing surplus in a way that has never been seen before in the agricultural sector. And this, of course, is why it's attracting all these urban professionals. I mean, I talk in the book about going to different African cities in different countries, and I'm meeting the guy who's the senior manager in the DVLA in Ghana, which is the vehicle licensing authority, but he's spending all his time farming. And in another place, I'm meeting the chief of police, but he's spending all his time farming. And, you know, they're not doing it for fun. They're doing it because there's money in this, right? I mean, also because they can get away with not spending the hours doing their day job. Yeah, so this is going on in the peri-urban areas, all the towns and cities now. I mean, I didn't go anywhere around going to the rural area around any big town or city where this was not happening. So this is like critically important. The one negative in Africa, and I think in a couple of months there's a new World Bank report coming out about this. The one negative with urbanization is that African cities have tended to urbanize with a high level of urban sprawl. So they're not as dense as cities in other countries. And this means that unit costs of infrastructure are unnecessarily high, that poor people spend a crazy amount of money on transport costs. You know, when they're surveyed, there are people in places like Lagos who are spending half their monthly income on transport, you know, to get to work and get back. And also because they're not on public facilities for things like garbage disposal or water supply, they're paying way more than people who are on public supplies of those things. So Africa needs to make its cities more dense. And you know, okay, so in the book I give an example from the first world because for the first, you know, for the sort of European and Americans reading the book about why this is important. So I talk about the role of London in the UK. So only two areas of the UK have a fiscal surplus. They produce more tax than they consume. One is the southeast, which is the area around, the principal area around London, where people who work and they commute into London. And two is London itself. And London generates 70% of the fiscal surplus for the whole of the UK. At the moment, overall for the UK, it's a deficit, but the surplus bits are the southeast and London, and 70% comes from London. I mean, this is extraordinary. And you go to all the lower population bits of the UK, like Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and other parts of the countryside, and they have a negative cost per person of $5,000 to $10,000 a year, and all that comes from London. So this is why Africa needs to focus on its cities, you know, whether it's Nairobi, whether it's Lagos, whether it's Addis, and make them dense and make them interconnected. Because Lum Pritchett, the American economist, was saying, because otherwise what happens is that they're not really cities, they're kind of agglomerations of little markets, you know, that they're not properly connected. So overall, the urbanization story is great, but African governments so far have not been strong enough, focused enough to get the density of population that is ideal in cities. And what was the other one?
The other one was just some of the common factors that you found across the 4 case studies that you took on that related to sort of coalition building and governance in so far as creating transformation and linking to food systems and agriculture.
Yeah, it sounds kind of cheap, but I don't think it is. It was just leadership, right? You know, so the Mauritius, it was Siwasago Rangulam was the key sort of founding father. The big division in Mauritius was between basically the ethnic Indian population that were brought in to replace the slave population after the ending of slavery. So they were the indentured labor, as they're called. And the big division was between them and the so-called Creole population, who are the descendants of the slave population, who came from Madagascar and Mozambique originally. And he won, Rangulam won like a 60% victory in the first election, but he still went to the leader of the Creole population and said, let's do a coalition government, because if half the people aren't with us, we won't get anything done. And they agreed, and that was how it started. In Botswana, you know, they were all ethnic Swana groups, but there were still significant differences between them. So Seretse brought together 8 different Swana groups and did very important things there. Like originally the natural resources belonged to the different ethnic groups. And he said, no, natural resources will make a law that they're all national, that they belong to that. So it was just kind of nation building and coalition building. And in Ethiopia, all wars had always been ethnic wars. You know, it's a very strange country, Ethiopia, because it's an empire, but it's completely unclear who the leading ethnic group are in the empire, because they've all had moments in the sun. The Eritreans, the Amhara, the Oromo, who became the biggest group, and no, I can't remember who the other group are. But anyway, they all historically fought with each other. So Meles said, you know, I'm going to create a coalition of all of this. And that was the Ethiopian People's Democratic Front was bringing all these groups together. As I said, the Tigrayans were always kind of manipulating things a bit behind the scene, but it still was a genuine governmental coalition. And similarly, I don't know, it's hard to make a judgment in Rwanda, but at the beginning, Kagame put Hutu in all the senior positions. And he said, oh, I just need to be defense minister. And since then, things have changed. But certainly there was a consciousness that you've got to bring people together in a multi-ethnic society, because ethnicity is incredibly powerful, and people, you know, will fall back on it and will fight over it if you don't create leadership that says, no, that's not going to be the thing that dominates us. We're going to be a government about development. And you know, when you do that, all of those places, the first policies that they concern themselves with were agricultural ones. And why did they concern themselves with agricultural policy? Because in a poor country, most people work in agriculture. So, you know, it's the old kind of utilitarian thing. What matters is that, you know, you do the best thing for the biggest number of people.
I like that line, best thing for the biggest number of people. With just a few minutes to close the webinar, I do want to turn to Professor Njuguna if you have a brief reflection on this, but also I mentioned right at the start of the webinar that we are marking 20 years of AGRA's existence. And what are the things from this conversation that we need to be really thinking about as we go into the next 2 decades? So we'll go from Professor, then back to you, Joe.
Thank you very much indeed, and I like Charles's presentation because I'm also a farmer. I'm a smallholder farmer, but mine was to make sure that I go to the rural areas to actually make sure those people in their small land holdings. But since there is a cooperative which is an aggregator, for example, for tea or even dairy milk, then it can work. But as Charles has made it very clear, for me, I wanted to create a demonstration. In fact, it is working very well for over 20 years now. But what happens is, what about the prices? Prices of inputs, for example. You can have very good dairy cows, but if you look at the bottom line, the unit cost of inputs actually kills you. Charles also mentioned the infrastructure. You need milk coolers, but then there is no electricity at night when you really need to put you have to suffer some losses. So there are so many things, but I am happy that the livelihood of the people that work for me and the people surrounding that, seeing what needs to be done, what new breeds of even super Napier that has come, or even what kind of cows they should keep, they have run from that. You know, we used to run linear probability models when we were young economists. But now we didn't realize that sociologists had the best answer. They told us that it is the progressive farmer model that actually produces better results. Everybody replicates what the progressive farmer model does. I'm happy about, Joe, the point you made about urbanization, because it has to be planned. When it is well planned, then it has a large hinterland in the rural areas to supply what they really want. And that is the market we are missing. For example, here in Kenya, here in Nairobi, for example, vegetables are supplied in 2 destinations. Fresh vegetables from all the way back into maybe 100 kilometers radius. They come to 2 destinations, and there is a vibrant market between 2 in the morning and 5 in the morning. Why is it? Because why is it working? It's because there is a market. But now, obviously, they will all complain about getting to Nairobi, the road infrastructure and all that. That's why they have to travel at night. Now, because you're saying this is the 20th year of AGRA, what has happened, especially in the agricultural sector, is we have to go back and look at the soil regeneration, because this is what has failed. That's why Charles said the food is scarce. Charles grew almost at the same time I was earlier, but I knew that we never had food scarcity when I was growing up. But right now, we have to supplement. I think we don't even have granaries. I used to ask my late mother, I used to ask her, what do you use with the granary? Because we used to put a lot of food in the granary. There's no granary because there's no surplus production. In fact, they have a deficit. So essentially, what has failed us is actually the soil quality, and we have to go into investments in soil regeneration. Now that AGRA is celebrating 20 years, we want to see the next decade on how we can go full scale in terms of soil regeneration, so that agricultural sector we are saying can produce the transformation we want can be functional. We want to make sure that it is productive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm going to give the last few minutes over to you, Joe, for your last reflections, but also the same question that I had posed to Professor around, as we mark this 20 years as an institution, what should we really be thinking about for the next 2 decades? Over to you.
Thank you. I mean, I would say with respect to AGRA that, you know, the model I always have in my head is, when working in agriculture, is that you want an institution to be super inductive. And this means that it's on the ground and decisions are based on what's seen in the ground, that it's meeting local needs. So for me, you know, if I were organizing something, I would try to have quite a high level of competition between different managers, but I would give them a lot of discretion about what to do with their spending. Because you can't, I don't think you can successfully plan, as I was saying earlier, agriculture from one central place and say, we're going to do it like this everywhere. Because for me, the thing that people fail to understand about agriculture is it's actually really quite complicated. You know, if you compare with manufacturing, particularly low value added manufacturing, you get a shed, you know, like a factory space, and you bring in machines. And most of the intellectual property is vested in the machine. You just need to learn what to do with the machine and use low-cost labor. If you look at agriculture and then you consider all the soil issues, all the climatic issues, all the planting issues, you know, I mean, just something as simple as not planting seeds at the same depth. All the questions of fertilizer, which ideally is going to vary, you know, every 50 kilometers or 80 kilometers or something, you know, based on, I mean, there are so many things. There is so much complexity in agriculture. And for this reason, I think that you need to do well in agriculture, my sense is that you need to devolve quite a lot of control to managers. But when you do that, the thing that is going to give you a bit of insurance is to have some competition between people who are doing the work, and they need, you know, and if they're not producing great results, they need to come and explain why. So I'd say that on AGRA. I suppose my one kind of pet thing is I hope that perhaps more work will be done on cooperatives. You know, none of the, I mean, the aid groups are spending less money than ever, but none of them do cooperative stuff that I'm aware of. And yet in every successful agricultural society in the world, you know, everywhere from Denmark to New Zealand to Australia, cooperatives exist to get cheaper prices for farmers and on inputs and higher prices on outputs. And I think that cooperatives exist in farming communities for very good reasons, but they're not easy to get running well. But if you can do it, I think there's a lot to be gained from that. Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, the one thing we didn't touch on with African agriculture, which I think is important, is that, you know, there is a manufacturing component to agriculture. It's the milling and the processing and the production of processed foods. And it's very important what is happening there in Africa now, because it's producing some of the biggest companies on the continent. You know, there are companies now turning over multi-billions of dollars. And the creation of big companies is very important in development, because only big companies have the cash flows to train their personnel, right? People working for 10-person firms, they never get training because there just isn't the money to pay for it. So these big companies in agricultural processing, I think, are very important, and it's going to be interesting to see how they developed. I mean, I talked briefly about Buckreza in Tanzania in the book, and they are milling, I think, in 8 countries now, in South and Eastern Africa. But then it's a bit like Southeast Asia, where a lot of big companies came out of agriculture. They've, you know, like CP Group in Thailand or Salim Group in Indonesia. Bakreza in Tanzania have gone into real estate, into petroleum products, into transportation, and I think they've got a football club, inevitably. So all of that stuff that's going on downstream in agriculture is important. And I guess going back to AGRA, it's something that AGRA needs to think about. What's our reaction to that? Is it all upside, or are there things we need to do to protect the interests of small farmers? But thank you so much for having me to talk. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Charles. This has been quite an enlightening discussion. We were joined by quite many people on the chat here on Zoom, but we were also joined by quite a number of people on LinkedIn. And I just want to say a very big thank you to the internal teams at AGRA that helped put this together, but also very much so to the speakers for availing their time today. This discussion wouldn't have been possible, obviously, as we had tamed it in conversation with Joe. So Joe, thank you so much for affording us your time. Professor Njuguna for showing up to this discussion very immersed. As we have promised, we will make sure a book gets to you. We'll also make sure a book gets to you, Charles. Thank you so much. To everybody that joined online, thank you. This is a series of webinars, so please do look out for the next date that will be announced for the webinar that happens in April. Once again, have a great afternoon, great evening, great good morning. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, and bye-bye.